Melissa, I was going to ask you this before I pressed record, but are you drinking coffee out of a glass?
No, it's a mug. It's a clear mug. It's a glass clear mug.
It's evidently made of glass. That's really weird, putting like a hot drink in
No,
a
no, no,
glass.
no, no, no. This is very classy. It's very nice. Um, yeah, it's what you do in first world countries when, um,
Mm.
you have a lot of money and you're successful.
Yeah, I wouldn't
We
know.
don't, we don't just drink. We don't drink out of like clay.
Right.
We don't have clay utensils, clay cups,
Yeah.
and um,
Yeah. Well, I
do
do.
you guys have paved roads, right? I wanted to use a metaphor of a pothole, hitting a pothole today when you're playing poker, but
You used that
I wasn't sure
yesterday.
if you guys have paved. Oh, that's right. But you guys have paved roads, so you know what
No,
I would tell.
dirt tracks, horse and cart,
Dirt,
kilns.
dirt.
We make our vessels for drinking and
Well, I know
on
that.
kilns.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, that answers that
All
question.
right.
You do have black coffee in
So
a glass, which is a bit odd, but I'll let the chat pros
there's not no,
tear
there's
you apart for
nothing
that.
odd.
I'll
Nothing odd about that. Nothing odd about that.
I'll leave that to
So
the chat pros. Today's topic is, well, it's the day after we just recorded, which is an anomaly. We're kind of stockpiling a bunch of Poker Distilled episodes for you guys, so you're watching this every week, but we're recording back-to-back days for, I think, the first time ever. And yesterday's episode, well, last week's episode to you guys was all about the ways in which poker can dupe you into thinking about things that aren't causally relevant. And we talked about the mental game aspect of that last time. And in particular, the idea that you can be in a temporary mental state that can blind you and delude you and lead you to making decisions for reasons that aren't logically and causally tied to the EV of the hand or your prosperity or win rate in the game. Today, I thought we could continue this exploration by looking at how to avoid poker anesthetic, how to avoid self-sedation in poker, because when you sedate yourself from True EV, which is definitely going to be a course that I make one day, we'll make a course called True EV, but True EV, for anyone that's not familiar with how we use that term at Carrot Corner, is the real EV of each line in each spot, based on all of the factors that might determine that. So for example, if you have 7-8 suited on the button at some 200 zone game or whatever that you're playing online, and somebody opens the cutoff and they appear to be a weaker player with a stack of 92 big blinds and they min open, you should 3-bet. And if you look at your chart, it will probably say fold 90% of the time, all 4%, 3-bet 6%, or something like that. And a good example of self-sedation in poker is to say, oh, I'm going to try and hit that frequency. Like, that's what I'm going to try and do here, because the chart does that. And you're kind of like lobotomizing yourself and preventing yourself from engaging with the things that truly matter, which would be skill edge. So you could ask, well, how much does that skill edge matter? With the 8-7 suited in that spot, how much EV am I gaining by my opponent being a 21 BB per 100 losing player and me being a small winner in the game? Like, what does that difference actually mean? And it means more than any frequency can ever mean in terms of EV, because frequencies don't equal EV. So stop saying that just because something has a high frequency that it must be better than something else. That's a delusion. It's not how solvers work. And even if that was how solvers worked, the EV swing would be really minuscule. And what we don't want to do is suppose that just because something is 0.01 of a big blind better in GTO, that's the thing we should automatically do in real life. So I would put it to you that the swing we're actually getting from that weaker player being the opener and them not going to not 4-bet bluffing us, really, because they don't do a lot of that, and playing badly post flop and stationing it off whenever we hit, and folding flop too often and not raising flop enough and all of that. I think those benefits are probably amounting to easily more than like the 2% of a big blind that it might lose in GTO to 3-bet that hand. So to me, it's a travesty if you don't 3-bet there. Like, if you don't 3-bet 8-7 suited against the cutoff min open fish, you've just hemorrhaged a large amount of EV. So something to think about, right? Don't wrap yourself in a cocoon of theory and charts and GTO outputs, and whatever you do, look out to the real world and make sure that you're engaging with that, because that is where true EV resides. It resides in the relationship between your hand and your options, the premises of the hand, like stack depth, position, etc., starting ranges, and then the player type and all the stuff that's going to happen
Mm-hmm.
later in the game tree based on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really easy to fall into a kind of trap of like, and if what I'm doing is approved, if it's on a chart,
Mm-hmm.
if it, if it has, if it's colored in on it, if it's one of the boxes colored in on a pre-flop chart, then whatever result may come of it, at least I wasn't outside of my range pre-flop,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that for a certain type of player, and I certainly fall into this category, there is a comfort in, there's a stability in that. So in other words, it's kind of like this rock that you can hold on to, and it offers you, I think, a false sense of security in an unstable alien world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very easy to become seduced by that, especially if you're running bad, if you've been on a downswing and you feel like you need something to some kind of rock to hold yourself to, for stability. That can be really seductive. And I think there's an argument that maybe there are times where it's maybe better, like your true EV will suffer if you stray too far from a GTO. At least I guess we're just talking maybe about pre-flop here to keep it simple. If you're too wide in a spot pre-flop, and you may think I have a skill edge, you may be wrong, number one. Number two, you may be misinterpreting the situation. Your opponent may be capable of doing something unpredictable, which obviously is always a possibility. But there are times where I feel like if I stray too far here, my EV is gonna suffer from it. So that true EV gap that you talked about, that little delta that you can fill in if you have that skill edge and if you're doing it effectively, I think sometimes can reverse itself, and it can be actually cause you to suffer in certain spots. I'm not saying always. I'm just saying that I think there's two sides to that coin.
Yeah, sure. But I guess one of the premises is that if the opponent is a recreational player and you're a regular, then you just de facto have a skill edge, right? Because
Sure.
not okay,
And of
not
course,
necessarily.
they're not. And I mean, a fish is not opening from early position or middle position with any. I mean, in a range that is like a GTO range.
No.
They're gonna be too wide.
Yep.
Or they're gonna be way too wide. Or if they're nitty, they're going to be, they're going to be way too overfolding. Yeah, to four bets or something like that. I had this spot yesterday, in my session yesterday, where I was under the gun with ace jack of spades, and I get a call from middle position fish who was in 90% of the hands. It folds around to big blind, who I'm sorry, I was under the gun +2, under the gun limped. I raised with ace jack suited, middle position called, folds back around to under the gun. He 3-bets me and the cold caller. And that's like, I'm never flatting that there. I mean, maybe in some situations I am, but like, I just feel like that's 4-betting. Like, I'm 4-betting that a lot. And I did, and I get 2 folds. And it's a situation where, like, I don't know if that's pre-approved or not. Like, but I'm thinking to myself, I have a guy to my left who's at 90% of hands who just cold called, and I want to isolate this under the gun player, so I'm 4-betting here. And they both happen to fold.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really careful there, because I'm sure you know this, but limp re-raises are in general pretty terrifying at a live 1-2 game. So unless you know the guy's range is wider in that specific spot, or he's more aware, or you've seen him like build a balanced or aggressive limp raise strategy before, you will not do well 4-betting against limp raises. If you run that 1,000 times against unknowns, you will hemorrhage a shit ton of money doing that. But
I think that's true.
maybe this is an
Yeah,
exception. It depends on the player.
I think that's true, but I'm using it as an example of like that deviating from what would be. I mean, we've talked before about that spot about the limp re-raise.
Yeah, but you've got to be able to
gun.
justify why you're deviating, right? You have to be able to say, oh, this guy was really aware that I'd been isolating this other player a lot, and I felt in that moment that they were likely doing it much wider than normal. If you have a read like that, then there's no issue, but it's getting a little bit away from what I'm trying to get at, which is that if you just have a very general vague spot where you have a skill edge, you should get involved in a hand whenever you think the baseline EV in theory is close to 0, because you're going to experience a positive swing. Like, that's a really natural and vague point that you can make, and it's very hard to refute, right? Like, if you go back to the 8-7 suited example, there's nothing I need to even think about there. I don't have to justify it. I don't need a read of any nature to know that I can 3-bet a rec player on average with 8-7 suited. Now, you might say, well, what if you're wrong? And when you say that, you're talking about on an individual level. I'm wrong about that opponent fitting the mold of the general opponent that min opens a cutoff. So let's say that opponent is actually a really aggro tilted guy that's just waiting to limp or to 4-bet to open and then 4-bet a lot. And that's like an absolutely tiny minority of fish that are going to do that, right? They're like going to 4-bet a lot as a bluff. And I run into that player. I don't care, because I operated on a general level, and I said 95 times out of 100, they will under 4-bet, and I'm willing to accept that in the very complex EV calculation that governs the true EV of 3-betting 8-7 suited, I've already allowed for branches where I'm wrong about that villain, and that villain happens to be an outlier guy who just 4-bets a ton, and that's okay. Like, we can absolutely live with that as long as we frame the generality / specificity of our read in the right way to start with, and say, I'm exploiting a pool. Like, I had this come up yesterday in a YouTube comment where someone said, well, what I struggle with is I bluff someone in a spot and they call with a hand I didn't expect them to call with. Does that make my bluff bad? And the answer is no. As long as you calibrated your bluff against the overall pool and not that one player who you didn't know anything about, right? Like, if that's someone against whom, like, you have no history and you don't know what their tendencies are, why on earth would you start guessing and stabbing in the dark about who that human is? You'd be better off playing against a pool of humans. So in a situation like that, where you say, I'm going to bluff the river because I think it gets through really often against humans, and you don't know the human in question, and that human in question happens to be a station, that's fine as long as it's a minority of the pool in that spot. So, but to your point, I think that you can absolutely take it way too far. Like, in your hand, I'm not even convinced to like the 4-bet, because it could well be that while you want to isolate that weak opponent that's got a 90 VPIP, if there's a big, giant, strong range in your way, like a roadblock, you might not be able to get at that range, right, that you're trying to play the pot against. So you can take this too far if you apply it in the wrong situations. And if, for example, like, I wake up on the button in my example and I have 8-3 suited instead of 8-7, and I try and 3-bet, well, now in the chart, you know, it's a pure fold, but not just that. That's not what matters. What matters is it's now costing me, I don't know, 0.21 of a big blind or something, like 0.16 of a big blind. I'm making this up, but it's a much more significant chunk than the 8-7 suited is costing me. So when you're like a beginner and you're just starting out at exploitative adjustments, I think it's great to just make the small ones first and at least get comfortable to that. Like, de-slave yourself, at least in the spots where you're almost indifferent in theory. And that's a great starting point for freedom. And then if you want to really emancipate yourself in the long run, you might even, like, you might ask yourself a question such as, well, what would it take for 3-betting the 8-5 suited to be correct? And I would be willing to wager it would take a hell of a lot less than you would think by staring at a chart that's segregated crudely with green and then black for fold versus 3-bet. I think that's a visual kind of illusion that gives us humans a sense that because there's one bright color here and another dark color there, that must be a big gulf between those two actions. When in fact, in terms of EV, it could be very slight, and it could be whispers in the wind. You know, it could be like the kind of thing that if the wind blows in a different direction, it's just gone. You can no longer hear it because of the way the wind's blowing. The wind here being the skill edge and what's really going on in the real true EV landscape.
Well, it's truly like, it's truly quote unquote thinking outside the box. Because if you like literally, like, if you move your cursor like a little bit to the left and look at the EV that's that's in that box. Like this is, I actually started doing this because you mentioned this concept in one of your videos. I think that was on YouTube maybe last week. And I started doing this and I thought, oh wow, like it does feel a little bit like getting out of a prison in the sense that you realize that you have a chart and then you have all of these areas outside the chart that are accessible to you, but you have to understand how to access them, and they have to be accessible. You have to, with great power comes great responsibility kind of thing. Yep. Like you can't stray, like you said, like your example of like the 8-3 offsuit or whatever.
Well, maybe you can, but you shouldn't start off by assuming that you can. Maybe you can, but like,
so you can't start there. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. No, I think it's a really interesting concept. And I think that, I don't mean to sound like the, I don't know, person, like whatever,
wet blanket,
the hall monitor here or something. But like, I do feel like if you're a beginning player, if you're maybe a losing or break even player, and this was me, 100%, this was me. The idea is to play less hands than more. than fewer, I would say. Like, I feel like you are understanding first what hands are in what boxes are colored in that chart is like the first step, and moving away from that is the second step. But I think the first step is understanding those boxes.
Yeah, I mean, this could be like, it's easy for me to say because I've got such a, I feel like I've got pre-flop ranges kind of tattooed into my skull. Like I just know roughly, like feeling around for pre-flop range to me is like feeling around like my bedside table to find like the light switch. Like I've done it loads of times and I know exactly where it is and I don't need the light to be on to do it successfully. But for the rank beginner starting out in the game, having a chart that says these are the parameters, this is where ace jack off becomes a fold. Like it becomes a fold when your opponent is under the gun and you're on the button. You don't get to do anything with ace jack off there. And they need to know that, because like if you start calling ace jack off against under the gun raises and you are a dog in the pool, like if with a skill edge, maybe you could make that profitable slightly, like maybe just about you could pull that off. I'm talking 6 max here, by the way, low jack. So if you flat ace jack off button versus under the gun, maybe with a scale edge you can make that break even, right? But if you're like a losing player in the game, or you're worse than the reg that opened and you do that, you're making a significant mistake. So right off the bat, you do want to learn like what the outline looks like, but you should also be taught that EV is a fluid thing. We don't teach beginners that EV is fluid. We teach beginners that EV doesn't even exist. We just say, oh, this is what you do. Here's the chart. Just do this. Copy this. This is the thing. This is not a thing. This solver goes small here. It goes big here. It doesn't bet here. Do that. And then they're like, okay, if I do that, I'll be good at poker. It's like, no, you'll never be good at poker like that. So I think what we need to do with poker players in general is we need to teach them theory, like in the Carrot Poker School. We need to show them the mechanics of the games, the nuts and bolts, right? In the same sense that if you learn to drive, fast cars, Formula One, let's say, you would need to know like how a Formula One car roughly operated. You need to know a little bit about it, right? But the main skill comes in how you actually handle and maneuver the car and how you adapt to your environments in real time, and how quickly and intuitively and accurately you can do that. So I think if you're trying to make a poker player, they need to start with the impression that their EV is this gauge that swings in quite a volatile manner based on quite a lot of real life factors. And they need to be taught that the EV in a solver is not their EV. It's just a model of what EV would be like in an equilibrium sim, where the strategies are locked to cause max indifference. It's a Nash equilibrium sim. So they need to be made aware of that. Because if you don't make people aware of that, they begin to think that mimicking and approximating an equilibrium strategy is the goal, when that couldn't be further from the truth. There are times when an equilibrium strategy will, let's say, bluff the river all in, it'll shove over a river bet with a certain blocker. It's like, I've got second pair and a straight blocker, and because my blockers are perfect, it's now 0 EV for me to jam over your overbet. And it's like, wow, okay. So in equilibrium, it's 0 EV for me. As long as I have the perfect blockers to jam over your river bet. Okay. Now, what's that based on? What's based on your range being exactly what the solver says the opponent's range is in the spot. okay, so what if I just change your range slightly in like 6 different places? I just like a child with a crayon go and scribble a new range for you that's just a bit different from the old one. Well, now it's like wildly winning or wildly losing for me to jam the river with this hand. So what the hell was the point in me trying to find the right blockers at the right frequency to be like the solver? There was absolutely no reason to ever try to do that. And I've been there. I've tried to do shit like that. And the reason I'm so like upset with this is that I could have been a way better. I could have been the coach that I am today and the player that I am today sooner had I not sedated and anesthetized myself with this shit for so long. And I kind of had to learn theory really well. I had to learn the mechanics to make the course. And I did learn the mechanics to make the Carrot Poker School. But when it comes to playing poker, I wish I had, you know, just not ever tried to do that in game. Like never tried to like approximate frequencies or anything in game, and just taken the raw concepts and then built upon them in true EV terms. Because I fluctuated and I flitted back and forth between trying to be a solver nerd in game and trying to be a real human. And I just lost a lot of confidence and I lost touch with all of that stuff we've talked about before that I really needed. And I could have been a better coach and I could have been a better player like 4 years ago had I not gone into that labyrinth so stupidly and blindly and irrationally. And I just like, I look back on it now, I'm like, how utterly silly. And I see people, you know, in this day and age doing that. I don't often watch like poker stuff on YouTube or whatever or content, but sometimes I'll come across something, or like one of my buddies or one of my coaches in Carrot Corner will send me a thing saying, look at these people talking about poker, and I'll watch it and they'll be like talking about things that don't matter. They'll be like, well, this is probably about a 70% frequency big bet, 30% frequency smaller bet. And I hear that and I'm like, oh my God, they just spent 20 minutes looking at solver output, trying to just get the frequency right without even asking the question of, what's this real life humans range and what do I do about it and how do I use my theory in that context? And it's just like kind of, I wouldn't say it's upsetting, but it's kind of like watching somebody do something badly, you know, behind the screen where you can't actually reach them or say it to them. So this is me like now kind of venting that frustration and saying, guys, please don't be like I was a few years ago. It's a really, really bad way to go, like learn the theory and then ask what's really going on and get good at that, knowing where that dial of EV is going.
Yeah. And I think that the more the more you learn and the more comfortable you get, and you talk about, you know, understanding pre-flop charts so well, it's like turning on the light in the dark next to your bed. And like the more you get to that point and comfortable with that, it does become, I think, easier and more intuitive to deviate appropriately and to understand that. I think it does take a while, and I think this is absolutely player dependent and depending on how much time you study and all of those other things, factors and personalities and all of that and your learning style. But it does take a little while to go from not understanding anything about theory to all of a sudden, you know, being like comfortable enough to be able to employ it, or at least to understand it as your foundation and then deviate appropriately. So I would say I'm in the category of just now, and I'm, you know, roughly 2 years into playing poker seriously. I'm just now really getting to the point where I feel like comfortable, first of all, understanding, okay, like the ace jack suited, like in that situation, this is a fold, right? Like this is generally something that, you know, you can't do. And then understanding my opponents, understanding what's happening in the game. And I'm not saying that situation was right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's what I did based on what I thought at the time was correct, based on the real world elements and not just a chart. But there's other examples too, where, you know, I feel more comfortable now because I have that foundation, and that is a nice place to be. And it's really, I think it makes poker a lot more fun, a lot more enjoyable. It makes it a lot more of an organic experience, like you're dealing with something that is living and breathing in front of you, rather than just like a cold, you know, computer game or something that's just like, oh, well, if I move this piece here, or if I press that button, if I, you know, use this sizing, I'm going to get that result. Like we talked about this in the previous episode of like what makes poker so fascinating is that you can't master it. and that if you could master it, it would become awful, and
Mm-hmm.
you would, it would be
Have
really
to play
disheartening.
chess.
I have to play chess, right? So I think this is maybe what you're saying in a certain way, is that, you fell into this rabbit hole of becoming this solver nerd, and it sucked you away from what you really could be, what you were really good at.
Yep.
And I think that understanding what you're really good at as a poker player is unique to you. And that's nothing that any solver will ever understand or mimic. And that if you lose that, or if you sacrifice that, or if you kind of, ignore that, or deviate from it in a sense of like being like, I'm going to have the perfect sizing here, I'm going to have the perfect frequency, I'm going to understand this algorithm perfectly in equilibrium,
Mm-hmm.
then I think you're really killing off a part of yourself. Like,
Yeah.
I think it's really bad. I think like it's like, I don't know, maybe like a metaphor is like people say like, oh, I don't want to become like a corporate
Mm-hmm.
drone and just like go to work every day and click buttons and then get my paycheck at the end of the week and then come back on Monday and do it all again. Like, I want to have a job where I have some, I'm thinking for myself, and I'm doing something different every day.
Right.
I think it's kind of like that. At least that's what I hear, what it sounds like to me listening to you. It's like you don't want to be a lifeless robot. There's more life in you, and there's more life in the game.
Yeah. And I think I was a lifeless robot for quite some time. And the thing is, like, you say, like, getting back to what the poker player is good at, like by getting in touch with the real range that their opponent has and outplaying that range and figuring out the highest TV line. And I agree with you that that is definitely like a strength I had when I first started playing and have rediscovered again now, and it is the source of true EV. But it's also how you use the theory that you know. So I think what you were saying
Mm-hmm.
earlier is really important, that the better you understand the mechanics of poker,
Mm-hmm.
the more fluent you are in the language of exploits, and the more easily
Right.
you can see deviations, unintentional for the most part,
Right.
in your opponent's game, and then find the clearest route to taking advantage of this. There was an absolutely absurd comment that was left on a YouTube video once, and like I laugh about it weekly when I remember it, and it was something like, Pete Clark doesn't actually understand ranges at all. He understands game trees, open brackets, the easy part, close brackets, but has a very poor understanding of ranges. And I was like, I remember reading this comment and being like, this is one of the stupidest, dumbest things I've ever heard. Because, like,
Which is saying something,
yeah, I mean, YouTube
because
really.
you hear a lot of stupid
Oh,
things.
yeah.
People
I
say a
mean,
lot of stupid
my
things to
friends
you.
tell me, like, stop reading the YouTube comments, Pete. Like, it'll drive you insane. But now I'm just totally
Yeah.
numb to, like, the stupidest ones. I'm just like, this is hilarious now. Like, it doesn't even bother me now. But I remember thinking, like, well, ranges are the ingredients of game trees. Like, game trees are just how ranges interact throughout various points in time with a certain structure of like bet sizing and the rules of the game and the flop, the turn, the river, the action sequences, and all of that. So like, it was really, really absurd. But like, when you understand theory, you get better at ranges and you get better at game trees, right? Like, I don't even know what the difference is here. Like, it's so silly to like use these as two separate things. But let's say that ranges are the exact composition of a theoretical range or a real human's range, depending on which you're talking about. And there is a difference. You should always be clear about which you are talking about. And let's say that game trees are the overall set of permutations describing how those two ranges interact each other around, in the environment of the rules of poker and the bet sizes and all of that you're allowed to use, right? So let's say the game tree is just like how the ranges interact with everything else, all the other paraphernalia of poker. And when you get good at theory, you get good at game trees. Because like a good theory course will teach you, this is why overbets are a decent idea here theoretically, because urgency is high. And when it's urgent for you to build the pot and you have a really strong hand in position, you can't check raise and you can't build it that way. And that's why betting a set is a pure action on the turn at SBR 9 in a single raise pot in position. That's why it's a pure action on most textures, as long as it's not like a flush or straight that's combinatorially abundant in the opponent's range. So when you understand that, that means that you understand ranges, because you understand that a set is a hand that's doing amazingly against your opponent's range and will be entitled to tons of the pot later and will have huge EV and huge equity and will be worth a lot of money as long as you put that money in the pot. Your hand is only worth as much as you can put in the pot. And then there is the idea of game trees, which is what happens if you check? Well, the pot stagnates, and now there are many hands in your opponent's range that you can't win as much from anymore because you allowed that pot stagnation for a street, and that pot stagnation was certain because you were in position and your opponent was out of position and you checked last on that street. So to me, the better you understand ranges and game trees, I'm going to use this absolutely misguided posters or YouTube commenters terminology here, but I'm going to try and improve it a bit. Like, you can start exploiting, because you can then say, well, hold on, in the game tree that I understand from my theoretical studies, the small blind is meant to check raise the turn with the top of their range at a high frequency instead of just probing after a flop goes check check, like in let's say like a single or in a single raised pot. But they don't really do that in the human realm, and I know that because I've just been around the block long enough to know what human ranges usually look like there. Even from quite good players, they won't find it enough usually. And so I'm going to delayed c-bet my optional bluff air hand at 100% frequency because I know it to be the best play now, based on that argument. So because I knew theory, and I knew the theoretical range and the theoretical game tree, I was able to ask how the exploitative real-world range and game tree were different and then find the right solution within that world. And that, to me, is what being a good poker player is. It's about combining the two. And I want to just finally say on this topic that you can go too far in the other direction if you try and teach a student exploits when there's no framework, when there's no like foundations to build the house on. If you just say, oh yeah, in that spot you just do this because like their range is this, but the student doesn't understand urgency, so he doesn't know why he should bet a set on the turn in the first place. It's like, well, this guy's range is really capped here and he won't bluff the river very much if you check, so you should bet. The student's like, okay, but then the student still checks in game because he just doesn't want the opponent to fold because he doesn't understand game tree and doesn't understand that the opponent folding isn't that bad of a thing in the overall game tree, even though it's a bad branch. So yeah, don't teach people just in terms of exploits on their own. That's like building a house on top of nothing. It just falls to the ground.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I just like another classic example of this is like you're out of when you're out of position and you have a set and then you check to your opponent, you can ask certain players why they do that. And they'll say, I checked for deception. Right. And it's like, no, you checked because you're out of position and the in position player can theoretically be the one to build a pot.
So they do the right thing and don't know how to explain the right reason for
it. Exactly. And then, I guess in another, there's the other benefit is you're protecting your checking range as well. But I
would argue that's not a benefit at all. I would argue that that's a byproduct that may or may not be desirable and has nothing to do with EV. I would say that that's noise, just in the same way that like trying to copy the solver is noise. Now, not necessarily in your heads up match that you're playing, Melissa. You will not want to have a totally underprotected checking range in some spot because that can be exploited over time. But what you have to ask is the imbalance I'm creating in my own game going to get me exploited, or is it more likely that it's going to exploit the opponent? So I would just like quickly.
Are you talking about in a full ring game?
Any game, you have to ask yourself that question. You can ask that question in any game. You can say, what does it matter that my checking range is unprotected here? My opponent's an old man coffee that's playing fit or fold. Why on earth would I want to protect my checking range, right? So before we say that's a benefit, that's not a priori a benefit. It might not be. Maximizing EV is a benefit a priori, like regardless of anything else. But having a balanced checking range is not. It may or may not be necessary and may or may not be desirable.
Fair enough. Right. But I think so then I fell into the trap that I was suggesting, I guess. But on another level though, I think if you were to ask most players, like they'll say something like, I checked for deception. And it's like, well, that was correct, but not for deception. That's all. That was my point ultimately. And I think the other trap that you mentioned is that this idea, like I have to build a pot because my opponent will not do it. Now, I think in I think in my pool that I play in, maybe this is consistent for most low to mid stakes players, I would say, is that you may be against, like, pool is, I think, overall fairly passive. I think there are exceptions, but generally I think as a rule, you're against passive opponents who don't bet, who don't bluff enough.
Yep.
And so, that's something that you're incorporating into your thinking as well, is that you don't have to check out of position. You don't have to. It's just an option. It's always, you don't have to bet when, in theory, you don't have to bet if your opponent will put in money into the pot.
Right, exactly.
In theory.
Yeah, it's just push and pull, right? It's yin and yang.
Right.
So like,
right.
if you're in a situation where the solver range bets, this is another one where people think about something that has no bearing on what's actually going to maximize EV. Like they're on a board like King 9 Deuce Rainbow, and they go, I'm going to bet my range to simplify. It's like, okay, you're going to simplify this for you. Poker's a zero-sum game. Your opponent is a bad poker player. Like your opponent is like the fish at the table, and you have decided to play every hand in your range in exactly the same way. You've made a decision about what to do with your hand based on your own relationship with the complexity of poker and based on what hands you currently don't have would do in your range. And neither of those has anything remotely to do with the best play against, Kevin the fish, let's call him, for the sake of it. No offense if your name's Kevin, although you're probably a fish if you're called Kevin. Apart from Kevin Rabbit Show, he's good. Just kidding.
We have a lot of Kevin fans, so don't take that personally.
Oh yeah, one of my streamers is called Kevin, isn't he? Oops. He's quite a good player though.
How about that reminds me of like that maybe you said this as a connection to Karen on the female side, like the Karens.
The Poker Karen, that's a Twitter account.
The Poker
right?
Karen. Yeah. I will say I hate that. I hate that trend. I think it's so dumb, and I think like that's infected like normie culture where like you see like boomers and like people being like, oh, look at this Karen in Starbucks complaining about her didn't get the right coffee or whatever. Like it's so dumb. And it's like Karen is a fine name and a lot of great people are named Karen. This is like my stand. And
I feel sorry for Karens because like there's a lot of Karens out there that aren't complainy or whingy people. And then there's like that middle manager Karen who like is literally the biggest pain in the ass ever, and she like kind of got her just desserts by having the name Karen be named after that coincidentally. But then there's all these other Karens that aren't like that. The pool of Karens
is fine, like good people, and so like there's no reason to deviate and turn Karen into a complete maniac. I mean, there are exceptions, sure, but like why demonize an entire pool of names?
And why not Linda? I would say Linda's way more of like a gripey kind of woman name than Karen, and there'll be loads of gripey men, and they're probably called Alan for the most part, I would guess. But yeah,
I know a lot of great people named Alan.
Do you? One of my best friends is named Alan.
Well, I know one person named Alan who's a dealer, and he's great. But
one of my favorite people in the world is named Alan, and one of my least favorite people that I come into contact with on a weekly basis is named Alan. So I'll just say that.
Anyways, I think the whole like tarring an entire name.
Yeah, it's terrible. Like everyone that's just called Karen is now like, oh, what's your name? It's Karen. Oh, how unfortunate for you. It's like your name may as well be steaming pile of dog shit. I know. Like at that point, like, and what's your name? Can I just take your name? Yes, it's steaming pile of dog shit. Like really? Yeah. That's no. That used to be a good name before the internet made it a bad one.
No one will be named Karen. Like moving forward, like no child being born in the last 2 or 3 years is named Karen. I guarantee you. Like unless your parents, I guess maybe are like totally disconnected from the internet.
Yeah, I think
what a blissful upbringing you will have. Unless you're I just don't see it happening. No. I don't see it happening. It's a shame.
Anyway, where were we? So going back to this range betting idea, right? You're going to be a Karen about simplifying the strategy. I actually hate that. It's actually turning into like a disrespectful slur, and it's really it's a shitty thing to say. Like it's a dumb shitty thing to say. I agree.
Yeah.
What really bugs me, final point on the Karen thing before I move on, is people that are activists who really care about reducing, or at least want to give the impression that they really care about combating racism, let's say, or they want to do something like that, and then they use the word Karen. And it's like, okay, you might not be, I don't know whether Karen is a racially charged name, I don't know whether it refers mainly to white people or not, or whatever, but let's stay clear of that, I have no idea. But you're still singling out a particular age, demographic, sex of human, you're still doing that. And it's just so fucking hypocritical to me that people
It's
that are
it's
against other
socially,
slurs would use
yeah.
that. Yeah.
It's like it's a form of socially acceptable bullying.
Hmm.
And I hate all bullies. I've always hated all bullies. And like I just like my response to that is like just an instinctual dislike.
Hmm.
Like because there's bullying that's not socially acceptable. And then there's bullying that's socially acceptable. And I don't care, like I almost like I don't know. People who bully in a socially acceptable way in some
Almost
ways are
worse,
almost
right?
worse
Yeah, yeah.
because
They're
they're
like
cowards.
snakes.
Because they're cowards, and
Hmm.
they're going along with whatever's trendy, and they're hiding. They're using these kinds of like the worst impulses of their personality, and they're hiding behind the
But they want
trends.
to do it only in a way that's safe for them. So they want to say, I'm going to
Right.
bully you and torment you, but I'm going to do it in the insulation of my pack, my online pack that the algorithm has
Right.
decided are going to like all of my stuff and vice versa, and will mutually support each other's tyranny
Right.
and each other's cruelty. And I think like
Right.
Karen is just one example in like a hugely long example list of
So
examples
many.
of that. Like I saw a thing, I saw this like quote on the internet and people were like sharing it on Twitter and liking it and stuff, and it said something to the effect of men should all start out in jail and prove their innocence or something like that. And it's like that sort of thing is normalized within certain factions of our society and our culture these days. And that's
Hmm.
because the overall sort of societal police, the cultural police, which do exist and should exist to some extent, right? We should, as a tribe or society, be able to police the actions of others and what they say and do, insofar as if they say something horrible and hurtful to another person, we can step in and say, you shouldn't do that. And if you do, there will be, like, if they're bullying someone, there should be consequences. If they're stealing or punching or being violent or setting things on fire, or I don't know,
Hmm.
dumping their litter in the lake, there should be
Hmm.
some form of consequences that society seeks upon that.
Hmm.
And I think we live in a really weird, unique age right now where certain forms of bullying against certain groups are now acceptable while most aren't. So like it's
Hmm.
okay to, in some, not, and I know that not everyone thinks it's okay to share banners that say that all men should start off in prison. Like there's definitely most people listening to this will think that's not okay, regardless of whether they're male or
Hmm.
female. Like that won't matter to a normal person who hasn't been insidiously culturally snared into like some subcluster of people with questionable ethical
Hmm.
beliefs who have had those, normalized and even rewarded within their own mini clusters.
Hmm.
Like most people would say that's not okay, but we're in a strange time where I don't think the overall cultural force for good has quite caught up with how quickly the internet has begun to multiply certain sets of beliefs or
Absolutely.
whatnot. Hmm.
Absolutely. No, it's so true. And I think it's harder than ever, but more important than ever to be an independent thinker and to think for yourself. And
Hmm.
it's like that's becoming so rare. And when you see it, it's like, wow, like that's so unusual because you're separate from the crowd. And um yeah, and I think ideology is just really powerful, and people get poisoned by
Hmm.
ideology all the time and
Yep.
they don't realize it. And um
And a good ideology is also powerful. There have been good ideologies throughout our
yes,
species' evolution that have. This cat is so
but I
adorable right now.
think
Look at him. But yeah, that have actually done a
I
ton of good.
think
Yeah.
yeah, but I think overall what does a ton of good is institutions,
Hmm.
that humans are inherently flawed and that we will always become violent and aggressive and turn on each other. And what keeps us from destroying each other is the power of our institution, the power of our laws, our courts, all of those things, which, the reason for like a limited government, but the government that we do have has to be extremely those institutions are extremely important because and that's the reason why so many, want to tear down institutions, because they are the last thing keeping us from, this kind of ruin, this kind of totalitarianism that is constantly threatening freedom. Anyways,
Brief
that's
interlude there.
my little rant. But I will say this: I don't want to. It's probably not wise, and I don't think we should get in. I don't think our listeners want to hear us get into any kind of serious talk about what's
Probably
going
not.
on in Israel right now.
Probably
But
not.
I will say that um, I have been very like depressed and disheartened by what I've seen, like the rise in like a lot of anti-Semitism worldwide. I find it extremely disturbing. And there's some things that I've witnessed that I never thought I'd live to see, especially after World War II. But I went back and I watched. I'd never seen the entire thing, but I watched Schindler's List,
Mm. Yeah, it's
and
a
I've
good movie.
watched another It's an amazing movie, and I watched another documentary on the Holocaust, and like I understand people feel a lot of different things about this, but I would encourage like people to just watch that and
Hmm.
just remind yourself of what happened in the Holocaust and what people are capable of with ideology. What that's
Yep.
that's my
And
little
I
piece
think you
on it.
can use it both
So,
ways as well. You can say like just as a rise of anti-Semitism is a really disturbing thing because it involves an entire group of people being sort of
mm-hmm.
persecuted and um being treated unfairly at the very least. You can say that the rise in Islamophobia is equally bad, and everything that's happening in the world right now is a polarizing tribalization, and I think that we should be able to discuss that, and you should be able to say, I think it's bad that this is happening without people going, but what about the suffering of
Yeah, yeah,
my
yeah,
tribe? It's like, well,
yeah.
one, they're not your tribe. Like, just because you've aligned
Right.
yourself with Israel or aligned yourself with Palestine or aligned yourself with political party A or B or C, you still that doesn't give you the right to just ignore everything else or to only care about one type of suffering or whatever. That is just tribalism and polarization all over again.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of
Right.
strong opinions on stuff like this, and we can do episodes on stuff that's not to do with poker as well. Life distilled, the world distilled, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, let's get back to poker for now. And what I would
Yeah.
say to the
Yeah.
audience is, if you enjoyed this foray into other stuff that wasn't poker related, do let us know. If it's upset you that we mentioned the conflict in Israel Palestine, like the world, that's part of the world. Like you're going to hear a lot of people talk about that, and most of the
Yeah.
people you're going to hear talk about that are going to be doing it in an argumentative, really heated, biased way. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some of the
Mm-hmm.
Piers Morgan interviews where he's got like one person from one side and one person from the other side, and it's just this vicious, like unproductive
Mm-hmm.
spat. And like that is
Mm-hmm.
that is upsetting and useless, and it's just tribalism, mediafied. But I would like to
Yeah.
think that you and I, Melissa, could handle not necessarily like the
Mm-hmm.
really big topics like that, but we could
Yeah.
maybe talk about some non-poker stuff and be reserved and thoughtful enough and respectful enough to be able to just have a productive conversation about it. And I think that's what's
Sure.
severely lacking in our world,
Sure.
is there aren't many people that are getting all of the clicks. Though those people aren't usually the ones getting loads of clicks and views. And
Yeah.
if they are, they're being attacked by a certain mob from a certain side, and people are trying to turn others against them. So even if someone does come out with a really balanced take, they'll still be sort of
Yeah.
attacked and accused of whatever. It's just the
Yeah.
way it goes, right? But yeah,
There are some. I
mhm,
mean, I think like Alex O'Connor comes to mind. He's a British YouTuber who incredibly smart
mhm,
guy, very young, but does a lot of like stuff around like atheism, religion, things
right.
like that. And he actually debated Ben Shapiro on whether religion is good for society.
Hmm.
It's fascinating. Both of them phenomenal, knew their stuff,
Hmm.
really good. And but yeah, I mean they don't walk away from it hating each other, like
Yeah.
it wasn't like they were at each other's throats. Like it was actually just like intelligent,
Yeah. And you
intelligent
could be agreeing
content.
like
Yeah.
about as much as it's possible to agree on things. Like whether religion is good for society for a guy like Shapiro is probably one of his most like fundamental values that he holds. Like I would imagine that
Of
he
course.
is
Yeah.
extremely,
Yeah.
his self sort of
He was
perception
on
of
the
the
con side.
world.
He was actually on the con side. No,
No,
kidding.
he was four, right? And I don't
Yeah.
know the other guy, but I could imagine that it couldn't be any
You
other
should watch
way.
his stuff. It's good.
Right.
You would like it. Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, guys, let us know what you think about that, because festive season's coming up. We're not opposed to just like doing an episode about something else. If you would like to hear us chatting about a different topic, let us know. We've done that for about 20 minutes here. It all came from how heated I got about the concept of range betting and playing your range against that
Yeah.
weaker
Yeah.
player, right? So that weaker
Let's get
player,
back to
and this
this.
can be a
Yeah.
fish or this can be a reg, checks to you, and you're in the hijack, and the board is king 10 deuce, and you know that the solver will bet 100% of its range, right, on King 10 Deuce hijack versus Big Blind. Okay, so that means that you should bet 100% of your range and stop differentiating between hands. But wait, if you stop differentiating between the hand that you have and the other hands that you could have, you're basically saying it doesn't matter which hand you have. And it follows from that you're saying that this fish is making you indifferent with every hand in your range. That this fish is making it right for you to play every hand in your range the same way. Wow, what a fucking player, what a fish. This guy must be incredible at poker. If Kevin is making you, is playing in such a way that you cannot gain any EV by checking back any part of your range, then Kevin has truly mastered poker. What a hero. Because let's say you had 10-8 on King 10 Deuce and Kevin was a probe monkey. Let's use that term. Kevin liked to probe the turn and probe the turn whenever given the chance. You checked, you showed weakness. I bet Kevin the probe monkey. Okay, very good. But if you bet, he's just going to overfold this range. He's just going to like play too passively. Or you bet, I don't want to fight there. I only want to fight after you've shown weakness. A bit like the bully that only bullies in socially acceptable pockets of the internet, shall we say. A bit like people who say that all men should start off in prison, shall we say. So when we go back to this idea then that Kevin likes to attack when checked to, but doesn't really raise flopsy bets or even make the right calls with pocket pairs there, let's say to 1/3. Well, now it's very clear to anyone that's remotely skilled in poker that you need to check 10-8, that it's better to check 10-8 than it is to bet, because when you check, Kevin bets hands that are drawing nearly dead at a really high frequency, and you don't get that money by betting. Yet you've said that you want to simplify the game tree for you, that your relationship to complexity and how hard you have to work is more important than getting more of Kevin's money in EV. And that is a huge, categorical procedural blunder.
But isn't this the same thing that we were just talking about in our little, when we went off on our little rant? It's like thinking for yourself, right? Like understanding this is one option, the range bet, right? This is an option here that is quote unquote solver approved. This is what the solver is doing here. I have a choice about what I want to do. I don't have to do that. I have a choice. And I think that distinction it sounds like a minor thing, but to be honest with you, it's not. And I've encountered this so much in my own game where I see, I see a flop of, ace 10, whatever, 7 or something, 9. And I think, oh, I can range bet this. And it's like, yeah, okay. But that's not the end of the inquiry. It's not like, this isn't just pushing a button. It's not just, you're not just doing something because that is what the solver does here. And I don't know. I think that's powerful. It's powerful to break that causal kind of firing in your brain, because poker is so complex. And especially if you're having a bad session, if you're down and you feel like this is an opportunity for me to pull some chips in my direction, there's the temptation is there. And acting, we talked about this in the last episode where I was talking about like acting before evaluating and the thought and an incomplete thought process. It's so satisfying to go through the right thought process, to go to the end of the inquiry, to not stop at the beginning. It feels so empowering. And it's like, and I think it begins to build over time. It builds your identity as a poker player. And one of the things that a solver does is it erodes your identity. It makes you feel less. It makes you feel less individual.
Yep.
Just like you would if you went along with all the morons yelling Charon.
Charon sounds like an evil villain from Lord of the Rings or something.
All the morons yelling Karen, or commenting on videos, that are just mindless, right? You gain individuality by saying, no, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not going to yell at this person who I think is in a different tribe than me. I'm not going to feel like I have some allegiance to people on the internet that, just happen to kind of come across my feed based on an algorithm. So anyways, not to make too broad a point here or to stretch this
Well,
metaphor too thin,
let's
but I do think there is a certain identity that you have to build for yourself as a poker player, and that identity starts with understanding theory, but understanding that you have a choice in how you deviate.
yeah, absolutely. But some people in the tribe don't want to be leaders. They don't want to be decision makers. And you could say, well, is that a problem? Like, does that mean that they're doing something wrong or that they're failing? And I think the only answer to that is no, that's not a problem. That doesn't mean that they're
No.
failing. Because if everyone was vying for power all the time and trying to call the shots, your tribe would just destroy itself in a second. Like, it wouldn't last a day, let alone, millennia. So I think in poker, there are different personality types as well. And there are poker players who want to be guided. They want to be led. They want to follow the teachings of an authority that they trust. And given that we live in a day and age where computers do everything way better than humans do, the sort of fallacy that springs very naturally up from that premise is that the solver is better at poker than any human, and therefore it's the ultimate authority on poker. And the problem with that is that the solver doesn't understand real human ranges and can't really understand real human ranges because it's just an algorithm. So while you might want to be more of you might have a personality type that is just you diligent, you get on with work, you just want to live a normal, happy life. You want just a regular path in life that isn't particularly creative. You don't want to have to be like charismatic or free thinking. You want to be told roughly what to do, and you want to just enjoy your life and get on with it. And there are people like that, and that's like totally fine. There's lots of people like that, and you need people who are very happy performing a role within a company who don't want to vie for the CEO role in order to make that company successful. If everybody wants to be the CEO of the company falls apart, right? So you do need people like that. But in poker, you're an entrepreneur. You're a one-man band. You have your own business, and you can't survive in business like that. You can't. There's no business that you can go into, that you can start yourself, where having the mentality that you don't want to be a leader is going to be fruitful. You need to be a leader. If you're a CEO, if you're a director of a company, you have to be a leader. And I would posit that as a poker player, you are a director of your own company, and you're the only person in that company. And I can tell you that when I founded Carrot Corner and began doing more and more things within that, the fact that I am naturally I have a personality type where I want to have power, not like I'm power crazed, but I do better when I have a say. I do better as like a leader type, as an influential person. That's definitely my calling. That's what I feel I've always been good at, is teaching and leading. And that's why running a business for me was very natural. It was like, this is great. This is exactly like what I'm put on in this world to do. This is what I'm naturally good at. And it was the same with poker. It was like running my own business. It was like, I will make these decisions for myself. In these cases, I will be creative. I will go out of my way. I will think outside of the box. And when I started becoming the solver nerd, I think I was running a business, but thinking like someone who was working for a director. So there was like business Pete, and then the poker player Pete had become like a follower of a solver. And it felt awful. And I would like dread going to work. I'd be like, oh, I have to go and talk more GTO. And I was good at it. I was good at GTO. I was good at explaining why this frequency was more than this, and why this combo and this blocker property did A, B, and C. I happened to be good at that, and I could convince people very easily of why a solver was doing what it was doing and be right. But that didn't make anyone a good poker player. And so when I think back to those years where I stopped being like the entrepreneur and as a poker player, and started being like a worker as a poker player, enslaved by the solver CEO. Pio was the CEO and I was the employee. I really questioned whether I gave my students back then a good enough service. I'm like, man, I could have done way better. I wish I'd come out of that sooner and got back to free thinking sooner.
But you had to go down that path. Like, that was your path, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't learn that. So, and I don't think there's any way that you could have shortcut that. But I like that idea of like, there's no employees in poker.
Yep.
There's just no, you can't be an employee. And that's so true, because you have to be your own boss. You have to have those qualities like you just mentioned. You're running the shop.
Yep.
If there's a bunch of people on the same block as you, all competing with each other and they're all doing the same thing, how do you get more customers? You do something different, you think differently. But I also think that on the flip side of it is you can go too far and people can say, well, yeah, I'm my own boss, so I can do whatever I want. I can neglect going into the shop. I can neglect opening it up for 2 weeks. I can take a vacation. I can spend money that I haven't really earned yet. I can take out more loans. I can behave irresponsibly, but who cares, because I can never get fired. So many people have that mentality at poker. It's like, you can't get fired from poker. You can't. No one's going to fire you from playing poker.
Right. So there's a whole
all
other
you
side to this then. There's like the people
Yeah,
who are too free and too much of their
right.
own boss. Yeah.
But people play poker for that reason.
hmm
And you know what? Good for them. They work, 40, 50, 60 hours a week. Maybe they, a stressful job and working for some jerk of a boss or something, and they come and they play poker and they're like, this is my time to not have those rules, and I'm going to do whatever I want. And yeah, I know it's terrible to play five deuce, here in this spot, but I don't care. I'm going to do it anyways because I haven't seen any good cards in the last 10 minutes and I didn't come here to fold, kind of
Right.
thing.
So there's a
And
balance.
that's the opposite.
So the balance means being a good director of a company, basically, where you are the employee
Yeah,
and
exactly.
you are the boss. So, like, to be successful in business, you need to have a combination of freedom and creativity and actually rewarding yourself with time off. Like I was just tweeting earlier about how when I made my YouTube video, I was then allowed to play a game of TFT, and that's a relationship between Boss Pete and Employee Pete. And I actually wrote the tweet and said, "Thanks, Boss Pete." And I meant that really sincerely, actually.
That's funny.
Far from
Yeah.
me having like a schizophrenic episode, that was actually me just saying, I know that the boss persona, the boss schema in
hmm
my psyche has allocated one game of TFT as a reward for completion of a video. Like my therapist
Yeah.
suggested I do this years ago when I was talking to my therapist about this. I was like, I'm not being that productive. He was like, why don't you try like rewarding yourself with incentives? So you want to play golf? Yeah, I feel like I'm just playing too much golf. Okay, well, why don't you reward yourself with golf if you've completed a task that you need to do? And it just worked really well.
Yeah.
So that to me
Yeah.
is the bonus. It's like for the poker player, if you can create a boss persona within your psyche that's authoritative and has your best interests at heart, like any good boss should, and lays down the ground rules in advance. This is a bit like the Petersonian idea of like the different versions of yourself looking after each other throughout time, the
hmm
contract
hmm
between you today and you 20 years from now, that being manifested in
hmm
the retirement fund that you've set up or whatever, right? That's just a contract between different versions of you throughout time. And so is play a game of TFT after you've done a YouTube video. I mean, it sounds like a fucking good gig, doesn't it? It's like, oh no, I have to talk about this game that I love, and then I get to play another game that I love, like perhaps even more in some ways. Sorry, poker players. But yeah, like it works really, really well because you have a healthy, flourishing relationship between boss you and employee you.
hmm
So in poker, that looks like I know that I have to like toe the line here. I have to walk the line. I can't just open 8-5 off under the gun because the boss me has set out in principle that I will never do something that I voluntarily, think is minus EV. I will never voluntarily do that thing. But at the same time, has to allow some creative freedom to the employee and say,
hmm
you get to decide whether you think betting 10-8 on King 10 Deuce is better or worse than checking it against Kevin. You get to decide that in game, and I trust you to make that decision. That's delegation. Now the employee is empowered. They're given some creativity. They have free reign to an extent, but there are boundaries and ground rules set up in advance. And I think that's the right relationship between those two versions of your psyche that you need to impose.
Great. I think we should title this episode there are no employees in poker.
I love it.
I like that.
I love that
Yeah.
title. You could write a
Yeah.
book with that title, actually.
Yeah. I just think that's so key. It's so important. And yeah, I think me with my personality, I would never have come anywhere near poker if I didn't feel that freedom and that sense of being able to be the leader and think creatively. No, I'm kidding.
Creatively?
Creatively. I
There we
can
go.
say creative in a creative way.
There you go. You just did.
I just did. All right. So this was an interesting episode.
Mm-hmm.
Took a little bit of a sideways path there, but I like that. I like keeping it loose.
Yeah.
I hope people listening, I hope you found it interesting. Let us know if you did or if you didn't, or maybe you pressed the fast forward 5-10 seconds thing on your phone, which is understandable. I hit that on podcasts that have commercials.
Mm-hmm. Same.
There's a podcast I listen to every day, and they start off with the most obnoxious advertisement.
Yep.
It's so bad, and I try and time it so I don't have to hear it. But
Yep.
But gosh, if you're like, I was thinking about like if you're a company advertising on podcasts, like buying ad time,
Mm-hmm.
you have to know that like 80% of the people listening just fast forward right through your ad.
Yeah, but that's part of it, right? Like most people, like when I run a pitch on a YouTube video, I don't do this all the way through, but like as I'm talking about a hand, I will throw in something about a course that's relevant to the hand as a sort of stomachable, if that's an adjective, a stomachable plug.
Digestible.
Stomachable. It's better. Being creative. See, I'm being creative with that one.
There you go, creative.
But when I agree with you, when it's like an ad read, when it's like 4 ads in a row, and Lex Friedman used to do this back in the day, you know, he would read out.
Does.
Well, now does he not just say to support the show, check out our sponsors?
Yeah, and then he says like for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be reading ads. So
I don't think he does that anymore. He used to do that.
He did it. I listened to the last episode. He did it. He front loads it. He does it all at the beginning.
That's weird because I swear that like the last few I listened to, he'd stop doing that. He'd just say, "This is the Lex Friedman podcast. To support the show, please check out our sponsors. And now, dear friends," and then he introduces the guest. I love Lex Friedman. He's great. I had a dream last night. Now that we're winding down, I had a dream last night that I was good friends with Elon Musk, and
really,
yeah, but we're on the same level. You know, like he was like, "Pete,
yeah,
you and I are kindred spirits, and you know, I see what you're doing at Carrot Corner, and I get it. It's just very similar to my life, and you know, we're very similar public figures." It was very much like he and I were the same. I woke up and I was like, oh no, actually Elon Musk is a bit more well known than I am, come to think of it. But that was a fun thing.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Did you see the clip of him where he basically told advertisers that were threatening to pull their ads from Twitter X? He told them to fuck off. That was good. But the other clip of that interview, which of course didn't make it in the media, but was circulating of the more like, I don't know, I guess you could call it like center right people on Twitter, was like this clip where he was like talking about how like, you know, all these people on the left that are supposedly like, you know, believe in climate change and want to do things to fix the climate, hate him. And he's like, nobody has done more than I have, like through like the invention of Tesla, the proliferation of electric cars into the mainstream, all of these things. And he's like, I actually did something to reduce, you know, to help the planet. I didn't just talk. Like I didn't just like go and block a street. I didn't just go and ruin some priceless work of art.
Ruin like a Wimbledon match or something.
Oh, God. Yeah. He's like, I actually did something and they all hate me for it. And that's like, I just thought that was it's so clear. It's like it's such an example of the hive mind. It's such an example of the ideology of like, well, the person who actually does something is vilified.
But then if he has,
and I'm not saying he is not controversial in other respects, sure. And I'm not saying he doesn't court a lot of it, but really thinking about it just from a practical point of view. I mean, the guy invented a whole line of cars of electric vehicles.
Yeah. But if that same guy has political beliefs that are contrary to what you like, and you have a collective of people who have the agenda of combating that, then it's very, very easy and tempting to, you know, launch a smear campaign, which is not like a official, organized, orchestrated thing. The thing is that smear campaigns these days, they're not like, back in the day, they were probably really targeted, and some of them still are, right? You do get smear campaigns that are still targeted and planned, and they're very deliberate, and that's really scary. But you also get ones that are just the hive mind doing its thing over time. Like I remember before I ever listened to a Jordan Peterson podcast, I used to be like kind of on the left, like when I was growing up, when I
Hmm.
was a lot younger. I
Hmm.
guess I don't really know why, but like just the friend groups I was part of at the time and stuff like that.
Just culturally,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was just kind of indoctrinated into this idea that like um anyone with right wing views was a big baddie kind of thing, like as I
Hmm.
was growing up.
Me too. Me
And
too.
when I first heard about Peterson, I heard about him from sources that were also on the left of the political spectrum, because that was where I was getting most of my, I guess, feed at the time. And it might not have been like in the days of
Hmm.
Twitter or whatever. I wasn't on Twitter then, but whatever social groups I was in or whatever, I was getting drip fed these thoughts about like, well, Peterson's a horrendous, like misogynistic bigot, and
Hmm.
he's so right
Hmm.
wing, and his views are dangerous, and all sorts of things like that. And then I don't agree with everything Peterson says. You know, there are things I disagree with him about, but for the most part, that isn't at all what I found when I actually switched on a podcast. I remember saying to um, a friend of ours in the Discord community as well, who had heard similar things and is on the left of the political spectrum. I remember saying, just watch one episode and tell me what you think. And
Hmm.
then they came back and said,
Hmm.
actually, yeah, that was like made a lot of sense in parts, and there was nothing even politically charged in there. Um,
Yeah.
so it's just very, very easy to be, you know, over time develop completely a false impression of someone or something or some ideology or some
Yeah.
belief or whatever. And the same happens in poker as well. It's so easy to like be
Yeah.
around solver nerds, and they through the smear campaign of exploitative players, like, oh, anyone that just doesn't use theory is just a stupid player making up reads. Like, you could be there. I was there at
Right.
one point. Or you could be in the other end where it's like, well, anyone that uses a solver is just a misguided nerd that doesn't know how to play poker. So like it just happens in any walk of life, right? And you just have to be. I want to quote my old English teacher from when I was back in high school, who said to me one day, I came in, it was like the last day of school in like the second last year of high school, and I was like handing in an essay or something, and I didn't have my school uniform on because it wasn't a school day, and I wore this t-shirt. I was a bit of a rebellious, like mosher kind of kid, like loved a bit of System of a Down, Metallica, Iron Maiden, like all of this, you know. I was like a rock kid. I wanted to smoke weed behind
Hmm.
the school instead of go to class, but I still played chess, and I was still a nerd at heart. Don't worry, guys, always been a nerd. I walked into school with this t-shirt on, and it said "Rebellion is the disease." No, blah, conformity is the disease, rebellion is the cure. And as I handed in my essay, she sort of looked at the t-shirt and said, what does that say? I sort of like proudly displayed it for her, and she said, well, while that may often be true, it really does pay to know how to walk the line. And I was like, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, whatever, like adult, square, you know, normie.
Hmm.
I will always
Hmm.
be a rebellion kid at heart and whatever. I was like 17,
Hmm.
so I obviously thought that like the kind of uber hedonistic freedom seeking beliefs I had at the time would always be my mindset, and boy was that a destructive thing to grow up believing. But I walked away thinking like, nah, that's too balanced for me. But yeah, it's been so
Yeah.
true. So whenever you hear something that's extreme, whenever you're being
Yeah.
bombarded with this like kind of poison in one side or the other, whether it's on the right or the left, or whether it's on the GTO side or
Yeah.
the exploitative side, always remember that the truth is in the middle. And if you know how to walk the line when everyone else is jumping off the wall in different directions, if you can walk along the wall, you will have the best view, because as they jump off, their view is no
Yeah.
longer there, whereas you will stay in the know. And the reason that that we're polarized, I think, and that we don't actually agree on anything anymore is that we jump so far off the wall that we can no longer see the bird's eye view of what's actually there. We just see our own little tribe and that distorted reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a that reminded me of one of my favorite lines from one of his songs he says, to live outside the law, you must be honest.
Hmm.
So it's like you have to like, I mean, take from it what you will, but I feel like it's the same thing. Like you want to live outside the world of the pre-flop chart,
Hmm.
you have to be honest about it.
Yeah.
And that honesty, I think, comes from understanding what you're doing and not just leaping into the
It comes
abyss.
from understanding
Uh,
that there is a world out there that's very real, that is not governed by the equilibrium output of a solver
right,
or
an
by a chart.
objective.
Yeah.
Right,
It's governed by
exactly,
human
exactly,
things. Yeah, it's a beautiful
exactly.
thing, and without that, poker gets very dry. But anyway, we have another episode to record soon, and that'll be the last episode of this season. Let us know what you think about this one. Do leave us some comments on YouTube. You know, if you're listening to this and you have listened to Poker Distilled for a while, remember that 90 out of 100 people, maybe more, don't actually tell us what they think about this show who watch it. Probably 99 out of 100 plus don't tell us what they think. So if you've got a spare moment
Yeah,
and you like Poker Distilled and there's things you like and things you don't like, your feedback is super valuable. And Melissa loves it. She loves to wake up in the morning to people saying
I
that
do.
they like her.
I
So,
do.
you know,
I
ever since
appreciate
she
it.
got her name changed from Karen to Melissa, she's, you know, she's needed quite a bit of positive reinforcement. So,
Yeah, I love it. And I have an idea for the last episode of the year. I want to talk about the best movie that I saw this year that is currently streaming on Netflix. So I'll give people a heads up. It's called May December. And so if you haven't seen it, you should see it. But I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to take like 5 minutes,
all right. I thought you
not
meant
more
the
than that.
whole episode was going to be about that.
No, I want
So
to
I
take
should
five
go
minutes.
watch that
I want
then
to give
before.
people a recommendation when you're traveling back home for the holidays with your family and you're sitting around and you have nothing to do and you're scrolling through Netflix. This is an amazing movie. It's the best movie I saw this year, maybe the best movie I've seen in the last couple of years. It's incredibly layered and psychologically interesting and deep and disturbing and wonderful. But there will probably be spoilers when I talk about it because I have to talk about the last scene in order to get the full effect.
Okay, then. So I should watch this too, then, right? So I can follow
Yes,
along.
please do, because I think you will get, especially you with your background in philosophy, will get a lot out of it because it's very much about it. The themes are very much in tune with what you and I talk about a lot, and it's very well done.
All right. Well, so we'll fit that into the last episode, whatever the main topic of that is.
It'll be our
Okay, guys.
end of the year recommendation. All right.
Good.
Bye, everyone.
We will see you next
Thanks.
time on Poker Distilled. Thanks.